Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a slightly delayed episode of the War Report. Now, we do have a bit to cover, so I suppose we will jump right into it. And starting with last episode, we covered the King of Kenosha, the acquittal of course, Kyle Rittenhouse, and there was no real backlash to that, and I will put a giant asterisk on that with what we're about to talk about. Now, you can't officially confirm that what we're about to talk about was backlash, but you kind of got to put two and two together in this case to see that. But in terms of protest, looting, any of that kind of stuff, fortunately, none of that happened. As we were saying, in the episode of there was that. Well, was it like three-person protest down in Chicago or wherever? Again,
Like
just these.
20, 25 white shit libs
Yeah,
protesting in Chicago.
yeah, just these very unimpressive showings, and the Sunday afterwards, so 2 days afterwards, on November, let's see, that would have been taking. I have to reference the calendar. The days all blur together at this point. That would have been on November 21st. You had in Waukesha, Wisconsin. That one always trips me up. Which is a smaller Midwestern town, much like Kenosha, about 20 miles out, where they had a Christmas parade. Again, like just one of those things. Is speaking as somebody who you know grew up and is very familiar with small Midwestern towns. Like just so one of the most like innocuous things you can do. Now, of course, this place you look at the racial demographics. Yeah, it's entirely white. The people there are entirely white. Um, Conspicuously, if you want to believe the media narrative, an SUV just plows into it at high speeds, and yeah, it's completely unrelated. It's clearly not intentional. The guy behind the wheel doesn't have a record. He especially doesn't have a record when it comes to vehicular assault with you know ex girlfriends. But again, that's all aside the point. And you look at this guy; he does not have a rap sheet as long as my arm. But again, these are all the things to you will garner if you get it from a mainstream outlet. Now, they've kept this thing under wraps. This thing has almost completely disappeared from the media, and we're probably still some of the last people talking about this at this point.
Hmm.
Even as far as this side is concerned, and so far as like the internet side of things is concerned. But I'm going to outright say, like, yeah, the two events are connected. This guy, and I'm not saying that he was too illogically motivated, but I believe we were discussing this on our last episode on the 20th, which was like a week and a half ago. It looks like the prevailing narrative that's caught on, especially among certain groups of people, is that the whole Kyle Rittenhouse incident was a racially charged incident and not like white on white, or should I say white on white passing, and if you're picking up what I'm putting down there. And uh, I believe with what we know, and I think that we're probably not going to hear another thing about this for as long as we live, at least from mainstream sources, that this guy was like, oh, I can't believe that the white supremacist system won again, and I'm mad. I'm gonna go take it out on I'm gonna go take it out on this. Now, the casualty numbers, and it's good luck getting a up to date report, but it was about 20 injured with I think 8 dead is the last I saw, and of course it's mostly old people and children that were the casualties as it usually is with these
Yeah.
sort of things. But you haven't heard a word about this guy. This story has completely disappeared from the media, and really, I suppose you could say, and you could go back to other notable cases. That one family from Iowa, the guy who had his daughter, like she was a murder victim of an illegal immigrant, and you have her parents out there talking about well, you know what, mate? We shouldn't judge as a group, and the food trucks are good. I mean, I I take no pleasure in saying this. Not like I am reveling in this or that I want to blackpill you or anything, but you would think once these incidents start becoming personal to people, once it really hits close to home, that you would finally see a serious reaction to it. And I'm not even saying that people will react in kind with like what that guy did, but at least some sort of like acknowledgement of a problem. But it seems like no matter how far you push it, for whatever reason, and maybe the media conditioning is just that good. And I'm willing to believe at this point with the way these past, you know, year and a half, 2 years have gone. I'm gonna outright say that. It looks like nobody is willing to even acknowledge the problem at this point. And really, I don't know what it will take in order for there to be an acknowledgement if these things just completely disappear from the media narrative. Even under, people were thinking once Biden got in office, well, maybe they'll throw us a few bones because, blue team back in charge and they'll need to, keep up the charade. But no, it doesn't even look like they're doing that anymore. But I seriously don't know at this point what, if anything, it would take to elicit any kind of response from the general public at this point.
Well, I mean, and to add to the bad news, Twitter's new CEO has now said that there will be a new policy when you're posting video of a private individual. And take, for instance, this recent video I saw on Telegram, but someone had posted it maybe on, I don't know where, maybe TikTok or maybe Twitter. And basically, it shows a much older boy running who's black, running after a white boy who's much smaller, uh, like less than two-thirds the size of this other boy. And the black boy catches up, hits him over the head, and the small white boy falls down. What could that? So what that would ostensibly mean is you can't publish that video because you don't have the consent of this private individual to do this. Now, the exception is if it's newsworthy. Well, guess what? The news media is not going to make it newsworthy, so you can't publish it. And before people start saying Twitter's not real life, Twitter is real life. Twitter is literally the way elites talk to one another
I mean, this is the
with
platform that even up to less than a year ago, the sitting president used that as his main form of communication with the general public.
right, right. And so it is real life. Just because someone doesn't know what Twitter is, they've never been on Twitter, is not important. We've always discussed on this program that every society is led by a minority, a well-organized minority. So the idea that it's not real life is ridiculous. It's a cope. It is real life, and it's scary. So that's what I'm most worried about is the next time there's a case like this, like you saw in Waukesha, it's all, they first planted the story, which is completely false. Within 24 hours, within even less than that, within 12 hours, the police chief already said that he was not being pursued. That didn't stop the news media from claiming that he was being pursued, implying that that's the reason he crashed into the crowd. The charges that were laid, all of them, are with intent. So that doesn't match the media narrative either. But then media has a message, right? And within liberalism, white people within a multicultural society and liberalism cannot succeed unless they adopt liberalism, which is counterintuitive for their own group interests. So it is, generally speaking, ruled by minority or by minorities in this sense. with an overarching minority. So um, it's very, very disheartening news. I'm very sure that once this case is resolved, hopefully it is resolved, but once it's resolved, you won't even hear about it. They are going to tuck this away.
There is going to be nowhere near the same level of press coverage as there was for Rittenhouse or these guys out of Georgia with that one other case. And again, I would say that, and this will somewhat segue into some of the other news we have, even with high profile trials of people who are probably some of the worst scum in the world, like Maxwell, like Ghislaine Maxwell, whose trial started this week. I would argue that trials like, um, well, what's his name? I think Daryl Brooks, the guy who did this Waukesha attack, is generally more important because again, with the Maxwell thing, you're going to hear a bunch of things you already know, and you're either going to have people like Maxwell get off with nothing or get off with almost nothing. And again, it's going to be a show trial, so the elites can be like, oh look, we're accountable too. We hold ourselves to account. Blah blah blah. I would argue in terms of, I mean, because look, we all know what's going to happen with them. We all know that they're going to keep doing what they do until they absolutely can't. And I don't think we're anywhere close to the I'm sorry to disappoint any Q people who may be on our audience, but I don't think we're close to mass arrests of these people anytime soon. But that being said, I would argue that when it comes to things like this, when it comes to direct attacks on what is really the American heartland, having wall to wall press coverage of these sort of trials is much more important than I would say any other sort of trial. The fact, again, about this, when this sort of stuff crosses into our community, when they do these sort of things, these people need their names and faces plastered over the media. And this is the same country that will take some murder case or some rape case from some town you've never heard of in the middle of nowhere because again the story was interesting because it was a rich white boy, pretty blonde girl. Again, you've seen it time and time and time again. But we won't make a national story out of an SUV plowing into a parade crowd. I mean, now, of course, we all know the reason why. This isn't this isn't me scratching my head wondering why. I know exactly what the score is, and I think you do, and I think everyone watching this probably does as well. But I still, and as much as it gets grating, and even to me personally, about pointing out the hypocrisy, it's not so much as pointing out the hypocrisy. It is so much as reinforcing that yes, they are in charge, and this is how they treat us, and that no, indeed, we are not equal to them on any level insofar as the system is concerned. It's time to start operating that way. Now, once again, I'm not advocating violence, blah 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 blah, but it is important to understand for the few people who have not broken that conditioning, working within the system is a losing formula. They will not give you the same treatment that they give themselves. They will not extend you the same courtesies that are legally enshrined to be extended to them. And it's time to drop the delusions that beyond a few points here and there, beyond a few guerrilla things that we can do, of course, non-violent, just to cover my own tracks there is no recourse within the system.
Right, and we should mention that Kyle Rittenhouse won't be going to the university of his choice, which was Arizona State University. He's been barred. A student socialist group has barred him from attending. They just raised a ruckus. They are determined to make his life a living hell in any way that they can. And even though he's been acquitted by a jury of his peers, I mean, he literally did nothing wrong, but you still find people on Twitter whose accounts are suspended for merely saying that, even though that's the fact, is that he did not do anything wrong. Um, and yet here we are. So
And
you know how stacked against us this is.
I mean, I say this time and time again, but really the only thing you can do is keep your head down and I mean, the, and maybe this will come off as an endorsement of acceleration. Maybe there's no way around this, but I have to say, I think the only way out is down. Now, I don't think we should be encouraging them
Yeah.
to do this sort of thing, but I think we should accept the inevitability that this thing isn't a nosedive. So we should be making preparations
Yeah, we'll get into that
to,
later.
yeah, we should be making preparations to weather that rather than thinking, oh, we can still take back control. We can still stand around, whatever. I mean, we should be, fleeing to the figurative and maybe in some cases literal mountains at this point. And I know I'm one to talk because I certainly haven't done as much preparation as I should have. But I mean, if you can make up where I have failed, then I'll feel like I would have accomplished something doing this entire thing. But with all that being said, I suppose we can move on to some brief Middle Eastern news, covering stuff from last week and this week as well. And of course, that is going into what other than Syria. So, the offensives around Idlib continue. Once again, vindicating yours truly. Last summer of Idlib, perhaps? Who knows? But with that being said, pro government forces are continuing to push and encircle the greater Idlib area inch by inch every day. You have the natural skirmishes along the Euphrates with uh, government forces, pro government forces, and as well as these ISIS cells. You'll see those. There's been casualties among the Syrian population and among the pro government forces, such as Iranian militias. You have, again, them sustaining casualties as well. You do have some skirmishes in southwestern Syria along the Jordanian border with, again, some of those villages that did disarm a few months back, but there was shelling of there with some of the holdouts. And what is interesting about Syria this week isn't, or this past week and a half, I should say, isn't what necessarily happened, but what didn't happen, what you haven't heard about. So things have been conspicuously quiet from Turkey this week on Syria. You haven't had any major actions. You haven't had troops move to the border. You haven't had any of this. And most of the action coming out of Syria has come from pro government forces in terms of, again, what's been happening in Idlib, what's been happening in northeastern Syria. And there hasn't been any major Turkish shellings. There hasn't been any major Turkish operations in the past couple weeks now. And the most you can point to is that you had some Turkish drones just flying over Syria, not even
Hmm.
taking any substantial actions. And I suppose we have been discussing Turkey has been looking for an out of Syria. There've been, except again, they just need something to justify their efforts there, something material to justify their efforts there, something they can point to their population. And again, Turkey's economy
In shambles.
is it. I would say yes, it's objectively in shambles at this point. Now, again, it's been something they've been fear mongering about since about 2017, 2018 that, oh, Turkey's economy, it's going to collapse any day now. Turkey is on the brink of economic ruin. Well, it looks like out of all that shrieking and hysteria, we're finally coming close to those predictions actually being true. And I wrote this off for so long because of how often it was said and with, the level of, like, with, like, how drastic it was presented to us. But I would say that we are in the situation where the media take on, and even the mainstream media take on the Turkish economy, insofar as they'll cover it, is actually reflecting reality now. And perhaps the greatest sign of that is how quiet they've been in Syria. And I'm not saying that as a joke. I'm not saying that in a tongue-in-cheek manner. but with how quiet they have been in Syria. Now, just to go off on a brief tangent about that, it does call into question, well, what will Turkey's role be going forward? Because they have invested themselves in all these conflicts in their backyard, whether that be in Syria, whether that be in Libya, whether that be in the Caucasus. And there's really only two things they can do from here. They can either double down on those, or they can turn tail and run. And really, looking at Erdogan's perspective, looking at this guy who wants to be the master of pivoting on the world stage, playing all these different powers against each other, is it worse for him to cut his losses and run? Does that look worse? Or is it worse for him to double down on this and sink himself further into these conflicts when his domestic situation is unfavorable, to say the least? And with that being said, there hasn't been any mass protest against him yet. It looks like, despite the
There's
shaky
been
economy,
some,
that yes, but there's been some, but like no like mass protests like
yes.
what you would expect. And
Right, good point.
an economy in shambles isn't a again, it isn't something that will automatically see you removed. I mean, the Iranians have been in precarious economic situations and have pulled out. I know that's a very loose example, and but again, it's not the death knell that it's usually presented as. But it's certainly not something you want to preside over. It's certainly something that will at least cost his party, at least cost his supporters, numbers in whatever the next regional election is. And um, I'm not sure when the next presidential elections in Turkey are. I'd have to look that up because depending on how long this crisis lasts, we could see a new government come into power. Now, again, those will be in 2023, so that's just over a year from now. But with that being said, there's no real notable opposition to Erdogan. There's no party, there's no individual you can
Hmm.
point to and say, well, this is the
The
person.
alternative doesn't
Yeah,
exist.
exactly. And any alternative would probably be a very messy coalition of pretty much everyone who is anti-Erdogan, whether that be the further right elements of Turkey, the much more nationalistic elements, all the way through the socialist and liberal parties. Again, sort of like what you have, funny enough, in Israel right now, where you have the hardliner right wingers allying with the shit libs and the socialists in order to keep down the main right wing party. So one could argue that that may be the case in Turkey, but the only thing saving Erdogan right now is that he's solidified such a base of support that there's no opposition figure you can even point to. Like even in
Hmm.
Russia with his contrivances, and of course he's completely astroturfed. Like they can point to Navalny, or if you want to get serious, you can point to again probably the Communist Party in Russia is the main vehicle of any real opposition. Point being is in those countries you can point to that, but in Turkey, there's no real opposition you could really bring out at this point, and they're even still trying to justify putting out statements that, oh, our operations in northern Syria are providing security right now. But getting back to Syria, again, things do continue on as usual. You do have a quite. You're starting to see the amount of casualties you saw when just Syrian officers were just getting assassinated left and right about I would say a year and a half ago, along the Euphrates by these ISIS remnant cells. You're starting to see those sort of situations pick up with Syrian and pro government militia leaders and people of, again, importance when it comes to security along the Euphrates um, are being assassinated or being attacked. And I mean, that's not a surprise. That never really stopped. But again, the main news, of course, is the further encirclement of Idlib. And coupled with that news about Turkey, it's more or less a question of when rather than if. And I do think that I'm going to be bold here and move up my prediction. Idlib will fall by next spring.
Hmm. Well, let's hope. I don't see them subsiding in their pressure against Idlib. Um, one of an HTS commander was killed last week. Um, Russia is still going along with their bombing campaign in Idlib as well as in central Syria around the Deir ez-Zor. So that's still continuing. And you don't hear much pushback. Of course, the West right now is very much on an anti-Russia campaign, but with respect to Ukraine and other countries are, of course, involved, like Belarus and Poland. But yeah, not much pressure there. So make hay while you can for the Russians. And hopefully the weakening still continues. Like I've always said, um, there are finances seeping into Idlib, but it's not enough. So even in moments like this where they're being attacked, they still have intergroup rivalry. They're not able to coordinate together. They still, are fighting for some kind of a little fiefdom. Meanwhile, they're losing ground, and we even have cases where the Syrian Arab Army has attacked and damaged one of the U.S.'s armored personnel carriers. Not an easy thing to do, and there's been so far no retribution for it. So, I mean, that's very interesting in and of itself. Up until now, basically what has happened is the Syrian Arab Army or the Russians have chased the Americans off the road or stopped them from, doing their patrols and so on, but never so much as to intentionally damage one of the vehicles. Maybe in a kind of a tussle, so to speak, as they tried to navigate the road. But this was an attack to destroy their vehicle. Not again quite at the level of, let's say, Iranian militias or militias that are sympathetic to Iran and Iraq, who regularly blow up, American convoys. Now, these are not American soldiers per se, but they are private individuals who work in a kind of semi-military capacity while they're there. And in fact, like one of the reasons the numbers are so low for casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan is because about it is equal, or if not slightly more, are private contractors that are killed in these operations against American presence there, and they are for the most part they're Americans.
Oh, certainly. And again, this has been a common trend in Syria, in the later part of the Afghan war, as same with the Iraqi war, especially with the intervention against ISIS, where these wars have been carried by American contractors. Now, I suppose when you consider that most of these contractors got their start just by being enlisted in the American military in some capacity, just with in a very standard way, it's really a difference without distinction. But point being is, these are not people who are actively part of the U.S. military and merely, again, contract work. And
Hmm.
this is the way it's been fought for, like I said, probably about I would say ever since the Iraq War, especially after that all went to hell when Bush's promises of being greeted as liberators and rebuilding democracy in Iraq didn't exactly pan out the way that the American people expected. Not that it was ever going to. That that is when the contractor wars begun because you couldn't sell to the American public the deployment of that large scale of troops for operations like that. But with that being said, when those forces take casualties, you'll notice actually going back to 2018, where Russian forces and Syrian forces were getting into regular skirmishes with American mercenaries. It is considered of much lower stakes when it comes to that because now there has been cases where proper U.S. troops have been attacked and have been involved in these skirmishes, but again, most of our troop presence in Syria has been a mercenary presence, which is also a way you can tell that we're delving into a late Empire stage.
Hmm.
That's just beside the point. But these casualties of mercenaries are much more easily covered up and much more easily swept under the rug if American people even know that there's mercenaries in these
Yeah.
countries. Like, for example, when Trump was talking about withdrawing from Syria, I would say the most common reaction, now the media want you to believe like it was outrage that we're abandoning our duty to X, Y, or Z, is most people probably thought, we have troops in Syria too? How many more troops do we have in this place and where else do we have them? Like, I think the general public did not realize that we had forces in Syria, or they thought we did, but they didn't know why. But again, it's a very murky situation, and if you don't make an effort to actively keep up with it, it's very easy to get lost. And I'll admit, I still have no idea what the so-called official or unofficial numbers of troops in Syria are,
Yeah.
or
And we're
really,
not supposed to know.
yeah, you're not supposed to know, or how many, if any, are left in Afghanistan or Iraq, because again, we had the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I would say more or less, it looks like we actually turned tail and run because we had no choice. We still have some residual presence in Iraq, I believe, but again, these things are so intentionally vague that you can't really keep up with it, and that's by design, as you were saying. But with all that being said, speaking of Afghanistan, moving on to some
Hmm.
interesting actions, you had some skirmishes between groups within a intra-Afghan conflict in southern Afghanistan, as well as Afghan-Iranian skirmishes along the
Yeah.
border. Now, there's speculation: is this ISIS-K? Is this the Taliban? Is this some other third offshoot group? Because what you have to understand about at least the modern incarnation of the Taliban, because if you look at the original Taliban, it was the personality cult of Mullah Omar, and that did work to an extent, having one just centralized leader without any real opposition calling the shots. It was inefficient, you could say, in some sense of the word, but it didn't lead to the constant infighting that you've had in pretty much every Afghan government since the Soviet government. But with that being said, is this new incarnation of the Taliban is much more um, coalition minded, if you will,
Yeah.
and this has led even during the American war in Afghanistan, where any local group can operate under the banner of the Taliban. And again, that can be either we're talking about just street gangs or we're talking about genuine Islamist groups, but pretty much any group that wants to assert authority can say, well, of course we're governing in the name of the Taliban, so you need to do X, Y, or Z. And that has led to some interesting situations. So it could be where these skirmishes with the Iranians along the border are from a group that calls themselves the Taliban, but isn't the Taliban proper, so to speak. Or once again, it could be genuinely ISIS-K because they just pop up at the most convenient times for
Yeah.
the
Really
American
weird.
Empire, and we still haven't figured out what the K stands for. That's a mystery that still baffles me to this day. Now I have some ideas, but I don't think those are friendly enough for YouTube, and especially not Twitter under its current leadership. But with that being said,
Yeah, I mean, with Afghanistan, the last time we were talking about Afghanistan was this is basically ISIS-K blowing up several Shia mosques, and this did prompt a reaction from the Taliban. So the Taliban now has started to more fully engage with ISIS-K because obviously, as you said, they're more coalition-minded this time. They have to be if they want the leadership. And Mrs. K knows that this is let's say a chink in the armor where if they do persist in uh, causing sectarian violence, that is, attacking these Shia mosques, and the Taliban not doing something about it, immediately points the finger at the Taliban for not being the coalition um, leader of Afghanistan, right? But now you've got, like, it is spreading. The conflict is spreading. It is getting worse. And the Taliban has gone to war with Iranian forces, skirmishes, not even, let's say, to the level of what we saw in Armenia with Azerbaijan last year. Less than that, but but deadly. And you have various warlords on either side of that border that are fighting each other. And this goes back all the way to Obama's surge back in 2011 and 2012. So this isn't really, conflicts with Iran is not new. And you remember when the Taliban did take over, Iran was the most hesitant of the three countries, which also included China and Russia, to begin working with them. So Iran has good reasons for this, primarily because they don't yet trust the Taliban, and they don't trust the Taliban to protect Shia Muslims within Afghanistan.
And again, that also goes back to the fact that the Taliban at this point is not a centralized organization. It's not really anything you can point to. Or, as you were telling me off there, you made a very interesting observation that the Taliban is just an idea. Okay, they're
Yeah,
just the
just an
students of
idea.
Islam. Okay, they have no organized structure. But getting back to that, whereas it may not be a distrust of the government in Kabul insofar as what they believe, but it's a distrust of the government in Kabul to control these outskirts of the country, because
Hmm.
that's been a perpetual problem for Afghanistan, where sure they might have good relations with whatever coalition is ruling the government and hold the cabinet minister positions, but you can't trust these people along the borders and these ethnic tribal groups or these gangs that operate under the banner of the Taliban, to the point where it does create some hesitancy from Iran in that case. Meanwhile, Afghanistan, the central government is working with Russia and China to the point where the Afghan government admitted today that or a couple days ago actually, that
Mm.
they do recognize Crimea as Russian territory. So it looks
What?
it looks
Then,
like America has now truly lost the war in Afghanistan.
are you kidding me? Have not
Well,
heard.
I'm pretty sure you sent that to me.
Oh, okay. What? I'm gonna have to check my Telegram.
Yeah,
This is
it's I think it was Southfront that reported on it, but point being is unless it was a really good fake out, but with the meetings happening between the Russian and Afghan governments, I do believe that Crimea is now recognized as Russia by the Afghan government.
that's amazing. Oh, yes, yes, I see it now. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this goes back even further. Like I just did a cursory Google search right now, and like there's articles from 2014 talking about how they do at least back Russia in that, but you do have the to the point where it's an official recognition of the annexation of Crimea by Afghanistan, which in this case you can. I said it in a tongue-in-cheek way at first, but I'm saying it in a much more serious way now. It is a recognition that America has lost the war in Afghanistan, and to the point where
Yeah, I know.
the big pivotal issue, at least the Obama era, you could say, has been
Yeah.
completely cast aside, and this is what we're living with now, and it's almost comical. I wouldn't. It is comical. I'm gonna outright say it.
I just like the idea that, imagine Trump comes back and it says all the best people recognize Crimea, Lukashenko, the Taliban, like.
Well, I mean, are you saying that Trump 2024 is finally going to be the completion of the Nazbol arc? I mean, at
Yeah,
this point,
yes.
there's worse options. I'll just say that. Uh,
Amazing.
yeah, but
Okay.
with that being said, I suppose we can touch on a few other things before we get into some of this Eastern European stuff. So, just touching on some Western European news. You don't scratch that. We're going to start with Ghislaine Maxwell, which is some more recent developments. Now, of course, this is Epstein's so-called mistress, and she was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, the infamous. I think he was a triple agent by the end of his career between the Mossad, the MI6, and the Russian intelligence. But very, very upstanding guy. Died in a tragic boating accident in 2008. And he was I mean the guy's what you think of when like you think of like a spy, like this guy, like, oh, he's secretive, he's all around the world, he has all these different contacts, like he almost seems made up. Like I it's almost hard to believe that somebody like him actually exists, but he did up until that
Mhm.
tragic boating accident in 2008, which I will reinforce is certainly an accident. And of course, his daughter Ghislaine Maxwell was very close to the infamous Jeffrey Epstein. Her trial has begun. She didn't suffer the same tragic fate as Epstein when it came to, again, conspicuously taking those bed sheets and offing herself. But I suppose that would have been too obvious after the whole Epstein thing, and this is actually garnering some public attention. And of course, there's no cameras in the courtroom, so we're reliant on the reports of journalists. Now, I haven't tried it out, but apparently there is an audio line that you can access via phone call in order to listen in on the trial if you are that interested. So we could see how
Mm.
that works out. But looking at the judge, let's just say, has the surname Nathan. I think you know what I'm getting at. And just no joke, it didn't quite look like Third Reich. She didn't quite look like Third Reich propaganda, but she looked like late 19th century anti-Jewish propaganda. That's what this judge looked like. And to quote some wise luminary I saw on Twitter, who I cannot be bothered to remember the name of at this point, quote, "This bitch is walking." And I genuinely believe that. I do think that Maxwell, looking at the circumstance of the trial, looking at her judge, looking at everything involved, is either going to get off very lightly or is going to not face any consequences at all for any of this. And once again, to reiterate, that bitch is walking, which I do fully believe. I fully endorse that statement that I don't think this is going to amount to anything. And I wouldn't quite call it a distraction, the fact that they even bring it up. But I do think, to the degree that does get brought up by anyone who is not people like us or people in these general online circles, it's to mock us, it's to rub it in our face, it's to remind us that these people will face no earthly consequences for their actions anytime soon. And really, I can't say I'm surprised. This would have been the outcome I would have expected before this. In my opinion, not that I think Epstein was this upstanding guy who just got, conned into this, but I do think the Maxwells, her and her father, were the masterminds behind this. I think they were the puppet masters. I think they were
Mhm.
the handlers of one Mr. Epstein, so to speak, and that he was more of the front guy. He was a friendly Jewish face they could put out there to lure in the American elites that wasn't too obviously Jewish to the point where, nobody would have looked at Epstein and thought, you are definitely a Mossad agent. Okay, before all of this. But you look at Maxwell, you look at the people Epstein knew, and then you realize, oh, you're a Mossad asset, and the actual agents are the people in charge of you. So, Epstein was a bit of a buffer. He was a middleman. He was, a go-between, if you will. But, I think we're looking at the actual, or at least somebody much closer to the puppet masters than this entire operation. And really, again, there's not much I can say about it beyond to reiterate for a third time, this bitch is walking.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Epstein is dead, so maybe some people who wanted justice will be satiated. Of course, justice is not complete because this was the primary person involved in finding basically vulnerable girls, almost all of them under 15, runaways for the most part, for like her husband or ex-husband's sexual exploits. I mean, this is a bizarre relationship to say the
And you
least.
want to get
And
really into what a lot of this is
I mean, it's a
uh,
honeypot
yeah,
too,
and
right?
a lot of this sex trafficking, if you want to get into this, conspicuously took place around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, with with where they were smuggling these underage girls out of. It was from places like Ukraine, places like the Czech Republic, all these former Eastern Bloc countries that were in shambles after 1991. And again, that's not the only place they got them from, but it's strange. It was a bunch of young white girls from Eastern Europe that were the primary targets of this. And like I said, you had, of course, from the U.S. as well. Conspicuously, and correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't have many from another human trafficking hub of Southeast Asia or South Asia in general, where you figured if that. I mean, if you want me to get into takes that would probably get me banned, I do think there's more to this. Like, obviously, these people are, and I say this with all the caveats of please don't sue me. These people are all allegedly, but almost certainly, child abusers in that sense. But if you want me to get more into my like schizo side, more into my esoteric side, I would say these people are almost certainly, but with the caveat of it just being an allegation. These people are ritualistic child abusers, and you look at that weird temple on Epstein Island. You look at the connections these people have. You look at again, just the sort of things that these people do, even outside this, like stuff like the Bohemian Grove. And again, maybe I'm getting too much in the schizophrenic territory, but I think there's something deeper to this. But again, that might just be obfuscation. But point being is, what we know for an almost certainty is, yeah, that these people are at least serial child abusers in that sense.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
with that being said, I do think that it goes deeper than that. But I'll spare you my rambling speculations on that for the time being. And again, at this point, Epstein was just this math professor who comes in this wealth all of a sudden, gets this private island, starts courting all these powerful people, and all of a sudden, well, he just has this woman who just so happens to be a daughter of one of the most infamous Mossad agents, just behind him the whole time, and with all these pictures of them, with them meeting with all these high-profile people, and more or less, it's all the people that you'd expect. Now, it gets really into the weeds of partisanship when it comes to this because a lot of people are eager to show like the Trump and Epstein picture. A lot of people are eager to show the Clinton and Epstein pictures, and again, it really gets in the weeds to the point where people completely miss the point that oh, this is a blackmail operation that nobody is spared from, and that everyone you think is a hero in the political sphere, well, almost everyone I should say, probably has some blackmail material in the hands of what was once Jeffrey Epstein and now who has ever succeeded his operation. And I still maintain to this day the fact that his ring got busted is proof that there are much darker, much larger, and much more insidious rings that we do not know about and we will probably never have any concrete evidence of so long as we live, unless some things really, really change. So again, this
Yeah,
is
I
this is
mean,
small potatoes compared to what can be reasonably speculated to exist and is still currently ongoing.
right. And I think the other thing to say about Epstein is that, back about, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about 2015, he was already arrested and then he was on bail. And then, like, people just kind of forgot about him. Now, I don't recall, like, I mean, I, of course, recall enough that he was arrested prior to Trump getting elected.
Yeah, that was 2008, and Acosta, who was a Trump cabinet member who had to resign because of this, was one of the prosecuting attorneys who
Right,
made him that really good plea deal.
right, exactly. And Horowitz is involved with this, and he's another Trump supporter. I would say that part of the reason that Epstein was dragged out again was because Trump got elected. It was a way to try to smear Trump, as it were, right? Um, Although Trump did go to Pedo Island, but he went once, and then he's barred Epstein from ever going into his hotel there in Florida. Um, I think it is something that backfired. Um, but as you say, they got another Trump figure close to Trump to quit, or you know, so you can take Michael Flynn. There's many examples. Manafort. There's all kinds of figures that were close to Trump that had to quit, had to go back into the woodwork because it was just too much smear, and it just debilitated the Trump presidency from acting in any effective way. And I think that was the major reason why Epstein could be sacrificed. So that other uh, realm above the realm that we're most accustomed to, that's probably the one that made the decision that they were going to go after Epstein. And Epstein had certain choices to make, and of course he would also implicate uh, the Clintons in this, I'm very sure. However, depending on what you believe, he would never betray the Clintons. So um, it was kind of a win-win situation for them because, in a sense, they wanted him to be able to smear Trump with, and that had very limited success. But they knocked off one figure. On the other hand, they risked him talking, but not really because he was in solitary and he was killed. So we'll never know. And he was quite expendable. Like it wasn't a very effective strategy. They got rid of a Trump figure that didn't have any important position really for Trump. Um, so it was just a limited success. But that's how expendable Epstein's life was. I mean, not that I care, obviously, but I'm just saying just from an observer's point of view, from a neutral position, it wasn't a lot. They didn't get much out of it, and they just liquidated him.
Oh, certainly. And like I said, I've held from the beginning that Epstein was never the puppet master. The Maxwells
Yeah.
even were never the puppet masters. And it's to the point where, again, like I said, it would take I think, collapse the empire sort of situation. And even then, in order to reveal the who's who of this. And one
Mhm.
conspicuous thing is when it came to the Epstein logs, it was a lot of just Western leaders. Now, I'm not saying the leaders of non-Western countries are much more virtuous, but I will say I don't think that Putin and Xi Jinping, whatever you want to say about them, I don't think they have these same proclivities. I think they're much more. Again, I think when you're much more quote unquote evil in the open sense, the much less likely you are to be,
Yes.
visiting islands like that. Like, for example, when you're making journalists disappear every other day, like Putin does, like, number one, okay, that's kind of cool, I'll admit. But I think when we're openly allowed to do that kind of stuff, you're much more likely to be you're much less likely, I should say, to be a deranged sex pervert. But point being is, uh, they probably like courted like these African and South American leaders. They probably have them somewhere else. They probably keep these operations very decentralized in order to blackmail the right people at the right time with the right information. I can imagine they probably have some hideout in Thailand or Southeast Asia, or one of those places that is another hotbed of sex trafficking. But
Hmm.
point being is getting on this like. Um, I wouldn't read too much into this. I wouldn't stake too much hope in this because number one, or I should say, this is going to be the fourth time I say it because this bitch is walking and Even if she wasn't, like I said, this is merely scratching the surface. This is merely the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this sort of depravity. And I suppose that being said, just a couple of pieces of news before we get into the some of the stuff with Russia and Ukraine. So Germany has formed a tentative coalition between the Green Party, the Social Democrats, and the Liberal Party, and you have Olaf Scholz as the chancellor. He's a social democrat, um, so he's in power. So that's what you can expect. You have Baerbock, the leader of the Green Party, the up and coming woman Annalise Baerbock, I believe it was. She's in charge of the foreign ministry, and I'm sure that will be interesting in light of Nord Stream 2 and German-Russian relations as it's been going on. Because we all know how much a young, or I should say young insofar as the political realm she's speaking, she's in her 40s, but we all know how much a middle-aged left-wing politician in Europe is going to view Russia. We all know how much love she's going to have for
Oh yeah.
Putin, and you know what? Maybe the old Labrador trick will still work even past Merkel, and it's a shame we never really got a proper send off to that bit. Putin's been terrorizing Merkel at the Labrador for years now. I mean, to the point where there's a very distinct possibility that that dog is probably has died of old age at this point, and he's had to bring in a replacement. But and look, we all know that Putin is he's a dog guy. He's a lot of dogs from what I've seen at least. But we'll see if that act works with any future German politicians and foreign ministers. But with that being said, you have that. And to touch briefly on some news out of France, you have Eric Zamor announcing his candidacy for president. Now, this is your far right guy who is of Algerian Jewish extraction. And one could say he's Trump 3.0, but I hate comparing things to Trump because, as much as a letdown and disappointment as Trump was, he had a lot of entertainment value that simply cannot be extrapolated to people who are considered the Trump of their country, like he would be like pretty much any quote unquote populist European politician. Now it's the same general right wing narratives that you've gotten where they'll come out with this very hard hitting nationalistic stuff, and in France you can get away with a bit more of it just because the very convoluted political nature there. But at the end of the day, it all defaults to the same thing. It's pro-Zionist. It's
Yeah.
we don't want too
It's
much change to
cocked.
the system. It's buck broken, so to speak. But with that being said, I see a lot of people getting their hopes up when they've played this routine many times
It-
before.
it-
Um,
it's remarkable.
and this isn't even to go on our ironic Macronism, even though it kind of is. But I mean, you have him. You almost gotta admire him just trying to push off all the migrants from France into the UK, which is happening right now. Where you have centrist liberal Macron like talking about like, oh, we don't want these people here, and the UK is a clown show run by a clown, pretty much to stop right insulting Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson's like, oh, I think we need to be accommodating to these migrants, but so it's a very weird inverted dynamic with that, how that works out there. But again, when it comes to some more, this is nothing we haven't heard previously from any of these sort of people. And again, I'm not staking any hope at all in this guy. Maybe he might be better than Macron. Maybe he'll be good on lockdown stuff, which we'll get into some of the lockdown stuff in a couple minutes here. Or maybe with on any number of things, but expecting him to be the fall of the empire, expecting him to be the guy who brings down the cabal, so to speak, that simply is not going to happen. And I will outright say, I was telling you this. My only hope for France right now is if those 20 retired military officers who put out that letter to the government and to the general public, assuming that isn't a bluff and they actually act on it, that's honestly the only hope I think we have for France is if
Yeah.
one of those guys is in charge of the country. Because other than that, you're not going to get any change, in my opinion. You're not going to get any real substantive change from any elected official. And I would say that goes for most parts of the Western world to the point where, unless they're complete accelerationists, in which case that comes with a myriad of drawbacks, as we could probably feel with the American economy right now. And
Mhm.
for those of us who are riding with Biden, which we may or may not have tentatively endorsed, some of us more than others back in 2020. You can start to feel some pain from that if you want to carry that to its logical conclusion. But with that being said, there is no electoral solution, I'd say, because
Yeah.
I know the saying is, oh, there's no political solution, or we're just doomed, and to a degree, I agree with that, but I suppose any and all solutions would technically be political, just given their nature. But I'll outright say, insofar as France is concerned, probably most Western countries, there is no electoral solution. Except, I think the fact that, and I don't know, maybe this is all an elaborate show that I'm just not keyed into. The fact that France can have 20 retired military officers put out a letter like that, I think shows that they have more hope than most countries. This that people don't run to realize that, hey, this is what's come to.
Yeah, I can't believe that there are people like excited about this guy. I mean, anytime you have an individual in Western so-called right-wing politics who is pro-Israel and without reservation and without compromise, like he's not there. I mean, he's not going to achieve anything. This is what Trump was. Trump was, more than America first. He was truly Israel first, and so there's no point in it. And yet people still have hope. I mean, I suppose I understand why they do. But like, his main purpose is basically to destroy Le Pen, like to completely trash her and get rid of her forever. That's his main position, right? For instance, you could argue that,
So it really is like a Yabik sort of situation.
yeah, right. Like you could argue that, um, I mean, she did very poorly in like her most recent debates and against Macron. And but what you want is they want the right to have like an internal conflict. And this is the guy that they're going to, he's the carrot. He's the carrot. But let's say he's elected. Let's say miraculously somehow um, he beats Le Pen as the primary right-wing candidate, and then he beats Macron, which is not going to happen. But like, let's suppose that happens. Um, then what you've got the same scenario that you have here, well, that you had in the States when Trump was elected. So, people argue, well, what's the worst he could do? And it's like, well, he's not going to actually do anything, right? What is the worst that the system will do in the name of countering him is what I'm afraid of. Now, you could argue and say, well, we're going down that path anyways. Or, uh, if nothing else, Trump was good because the mask came off. And that's true. The mask came off. Um, that was accelerationism. That did take place. And overall, that's a good thing, especially if we acknowledge that there's no political solution. I suppose, though, with Zamora, I think it's even a more it's it's a known it's a known product much more than Trump was, right? We know how this is going to go, and I don't see how he is going to one, accomplish anything, two, really sway the public uh, in a way that he wins. So I think he's there. He's basically there to let off some steam uh, for for Europeans who are invested in their culture and their history, and for its prolongment, who are understandably upset. His whole entire purpose is just to give them a voice for the moment, and that's it. There's nothing. I don't know. I don't want to. I don't want to seem too negative, but I do fundamentally believe that.
Yeah, I would agree, and I do think there's an argument for Zamor in terms of just chipping away at the legitimacy of the system, similar to how Trump was, similar to how what Brexit was. So I could understand that perspective. Now I think that only goes so far, but again, I'm gonna outright say, as larpy as it sounds, I think those retired officers in France are really the only shot they have at still being a functional country. You know, and that will have to happen sooner than
Yeah.
later. And if there's any Western country it would happen in, it would be France. And with that, but
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I'm sure our audience knows, just listening to the show for what are we at 188 episodes, that toying around with politics and electoral politics and the institution democracy is it's a fool's errand at this point, and I wouldn't put any hope in any leader who wins via ballot box. And
Yeah.
ballot box that isn't stuffed, at least, okay? Because I think, yeah, but yeah, I think you guys get the point here. But moving on to that, there's quite a bit of news about Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and those dreaded pipelines. Now, I know that you're just chomping at the bit, so I will give you free reign to go as in depth with this as you want to.
Well, there is so much to discuss with Russia and America and Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. One doesn't even know where to begin. But you did mention the pipeline. So you know what? It's worth starting there. So there's been a back and forth. Um, the last statement that I saw was that Merkel had asked America not to sanction um, the pipelines, Nord Stream 2, right? Um, Primarily because Germany needs it. France is a different kind of country because it, well, first of all, it has so much nuclear energy that it's the biggest supplier of electricity in you know in Europe and maybe for over half the world. So it has a lot of nuclear energy, and it's not really worried about this. So I would say that Germany is in need of it, but that doesn't mean Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, they're in need of it as well. Italy, the list goes on and on. But France is fine now. But that's just one, even though it's a powerful country. So um, there's been a back and forth. There's a lot of pressure from the neocon contingent of the U.S. Where they they want more sanctions on Russia. So they're looking for anything that can hurt them, and there's a lot of a lot of the neocons are they have an ethnic grudge against Russia that has nothing to do with Putin. It goes back a long, long way, and they will not rest till Russia is completely destroyed. So that's how crazy they are. And America is just simply a country that's a means to an end to do that. So that's one angle. Now they're still mulling over that. I think the U.S. is still going to have a new list of sanctions. Of course, Ukraine and Poland are also adamant that there should be sanctions against Nord Stream 2. Ukraine is particularly a funny country because it thinks that Russia still owes it uh, oil and gas, but it should also Russia should also be sanctioned as well. So they should get really good prices. They should be allowed to be a transit country. They should be hostile toward Russia. They should be allowed to have They should be allowed to become a NATO member. They should be allowed to have missiles there. They should be allowed all kinds of things, which is ridiculous. That's not going to happen. And this is sort of the crux of the problem, because Ukraine also, of course, is interested in taking back the Donbass. And as we saw in April, they amassed their army. At this point in time, half of Ukraine's army is on the border. There has already begun shelling in one of the border towns that is held by Donbass. No heavy artillery, but grenade launchers, armored vehicles, machine guns, that sort of thing. And we remember what happened last time is that Russia basically had about 150,000 troops that amassed along its border, including ships that got very close to Odessa. And basically, Ukraine panicked. And for that part, so did America. They panicked and they did not want, a full-scale war. But it's, how can I put it? This is a situation that's almost impossible to resolve unless America, NATO, and Ukraine all agree that Crimea is Russia, and for that part, so is Donbass. And that's something that they will never agree to. And for them, it's a loss that if they do. Now, this tension of back and forth, amassing troops, relieving those troops, another escalation. You wonder who is in charge. You wonder if the Americans are goading them. Biden's presidency is fraught with all kinds of problems. He's not the guy who's really making the decisions here. So there are probably factions within his administration that are at odds with one another about what to do next. And that is also confusing the Ukrainians as well. And they too might be divided. Um, Zelensky's ratings are particularly low. Um, and there's all these rumors of certain oligarchs that want him removed. And it's not that they're oligarchs on the side of Putin. They're just basically oligarchs that don't like him or don't think he's doing a really good job for whatever reasons, right? Putin is not one of these guys that was obsessed about Ukraine, despite his rhetoric now, right? Like he fell for a really old Obama trick. He was hosting the Sochi Winter Olympics, and Obama was making a big deal about gay rights because Putin had just created a law against gay and trans indoctrination or education in 2014. And so the Western media jumped all over it. Um, they made this like the worst plight in the world. And while that was happening, Ukraine was falling apart. And now I think he acted very quickly and resourcefully and managed to gain Crimea out of it. But it could have gone worse. But he was fast on his feet nonetheless. But ultimately, it's not something he would have wanted. And so now he has to care a lot about Ukraine, right? Whereas before, I think he felt like he could neglect it. Um, so I think he's kind of learned the tactics, including Biden's tactics, which to some degree are a carryover of the Obama tactics, right? He's going to try to swamp Putin with all kinds of crazy agreements that are not to be trusted. Uh, Hillary Clinton made a big deal about the reset, but that was only so that they could claim that Russia is not going along with the reset. They're the baddies. There was an overture, for instance, about when the CIA representative came to Moscow about how an offer was made that Russia was allowed to pursue its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet states, as long as it did not ally itself with China, right? And then a week later, you have Jens Stoltenberg saying, "We don't, in a matter of in different words." he basically said we don't respect Russia's interests here or their red lines. And then today he was asked to expand on that. And, like, how are you going to help Ukraine? Basically, he mentioned 10 different ways till Tuesday about how they're going to protect Ukraine, except the one that is on everybody's mind, and that is militarily, right? So the US is in a bind here. The combination of Russia and China is too much for it. Um, it needs to stop China taking over Taiwan, and it needs to stop Russia from gaining more power in Europe. But it's running out of time. And these games that they're basically playing, offering these, sweetheart deals that ultimately would leave either country in a weaker position, are not. Russia's not pouncing on them, right? So Russia is not going to not align itself with China because America said, you know what, I'm going to give you like your former Soviet space. First of all, that's not going to happen, and Putin knows that. And second of all, it would be harder for him to do that if he wasn't cooperating more fully with China. So he's not stupid. He's never going to go for that deal. Um, China and Russia both understand that if within by 2024, the game will be very different. At that point, China's military will be too big, too strong to engage in a full out war with the US, where the US will have acceptable losses, right? So, China, as we've always said on this show, China and Russia are playing the long game. They don't want a war. They don't need a war. They need about 2.5 years. It's America that needs this war. Now, it does not look like the intermediaries are going to work out very well for Biden. 2022 looks like it's going to be a wash. We don't know, but it's not looking very good. His popularity is terrible. Kamala's is even worse, even though you hardly see her, but she's so, I don't know, she's so unlikable. And 2024, for that matter, is also looking very questionable. So the allure of having a war that's quickly won in Ukraine is tempting, right? Of course, if they lose, the consequences are incredible, right? In a sense, America is better off pretending to be the power that it once was than taking the chance of going to war in Ukraine. Um, Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, America's already hinting that they're not going to enter the war if a war breaks out there. They will definitely supply more deadly weapons to Ukraine, yes, but Ukrainians themselves do not believe that this war is winnable without participation of NATO, right? And like I say, uh, on the present circumstances, uh, this is not a winnable war for the U.S. So if the U.S. goads Ukraine into fighting Russia vis-a-vis attacking Donbass first, and mind you, Russia tolerates these skirmishes, even some pretty heavy bombing of Donbass. It's not really like um, they won't allow a fly to land on Donbass. It's not like that, right? But if the shelling gets very intensive, they have said that's a red line. Uh, Joining NATO is a red line. So
And something to consider about what you were saying about the Donbass is, I believe it was in September 2019, or correct me if I'm wrong, where
mhm,
Russia just began issuing blanket passports to residents of
yeah,
the Donbass region. And it's gotten to the point where pretty much everyone who isn't willing to stand and fight for the Donbass has left, and most of them have, no surprise, gone to Russia.
right.
Whether that for economic opportunity, for safety, whatever. So
Hmm.
it's the point where I don't know the demographics, but the bulk of the people you've seen in the Donbass, no surprise because it's a military conflict, are, again, young fighting age men and people who are willing to stand, fight, and die for the cause. And with that, of course, they are, and so are the Russians, willing to accept some level of casualties. But if it's an absolute massacre, so to speak, that is going to lead to some degree of Russian intervention. Now, what that may look like, I don't know. But point being is, as you were saying, they just need to hold out for a few more years, which the sanctions aren't working, so they've moved on to trying to
Yes.
sabotage Nord Stream 2 and Russian German relations. The sanctions haven't worked since about. Well, they never worked, let's put it that way. And but even the economic shock that we saw in 2015, 2016, that's since been recovered. Now, I'm not saying that Russia has a stellar economy or anything. I'm sure that any Russians we may have in the audience can give us a more detailed situation of what it actually does look like on the ground.
Hmm.
But the point being is, at the end of the day, time, and this contradicts everything they've been telling us the past 20 years. Time is on the side of Russia, and time also, in unrelated since you're saying, is on the side of China. Really,
Yeah.
it just I believe we discussed this before, that it's going to be the capitulation of Ukraine and or Taiwan that is really going to signal the end of the American empire. And I think Afghanistan was a precursor to that, showing that America is no longer capable of keeping the commitments that they had previously made over the past 20 to 30 years. And
Hmm.
uh, I don't know when those two events will happen, if those two events will happen, how they would play out. Obviously, I believe that the capitulation of Ukraine is much more feasible than Taiwan being reintegrated into China proper. But I'm
Yeah.
saying both are exponentially more likely than they would have been even just 3 years ago, even just back in 2017, 2018. But that being said, again, it will depend a lot on the internal situation of the United States and the West, how these two events play out. But it looks like every Ukrainian offensive and every fear mongering about Russian troops in the border has ever diminishing returns to Ukraine because uh, it does ebb and flow, but it does as a general trend. Westerners, Americans in particular, caring about Ukraine tends to be less and less as the years go on because after Crimea, you had a lot of people coming out and saying we must stand up to Russia. Why isn't Obama doing anything? When Trump got into office, of course, it was, oh no, we have a Russian puppet in office. We need to stand up to the Russians. We need to stand up to Putin. The fight begins in Ukraine. Similar rhetoric under Biden. We finally have a president who will, stand up to Russia, stand up for Ukraine. But as time goes on, that becomes ever more diminishing. I don't know, maybe girl boss Kamala will be the one who frees Crimea, but I don't see that happening anytime soon, by any means.
Yeah.
And again, it's gaining more legitimacy, and Russia, I should say, is solidifying its sphere, and the Crimea issue is slowly but surely gaining more legitimacy. Now, I know Afghanistan and Bulgaria aren't movers and shakers in the world stage, but you had the president of Bulgaria say during his re-election campaign that Crimea is Russia, showing that, again, despite what may happen with the European Union and NATO, there are certain attitudes that are fixed within these populations that cannot be moved. Now, Bulgaria is this interesting case because these are also the ones who do not recognize Kosovo, who have maintained a generally positive relationship with Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union compared to other Eastern European states and other Balkan states. I don't know. I would say the only ones who probably have them beat are Serbia at that point, but
Hmm.
um, and I don't know. There's probably others, but Bulgaria is one of the countries that is much more conciliatory to Russia as far as Eastern Europe is concerned, and in terms of legitimacy of Crimea and integration of the greater Russian nation, so to speak, you have Lukashenko taking his first visit to Crimea after his relative victory in this most recent debacle with the migrants and sending them back and the Polish border disputes. So, I mean, I suppose in just a couple of years, if you want to be generous. He would have traveled to one part of Russia to another, but for the time being, right now, he visited Crimea from Belarus, and I mean, at this point, the capitulation of Ukraine, just to touch on that issue again, seems more or less inevitable. Taiwan, especially if something happens in the next 2 years, I think there's a fighting chance. I think there might be blood spilled over Taiwan, but there will be no Western blood spilled over Ukraine. I don't think, in
Hmm.
any
Hmm.
realistic sense. Again, maybe some mercenaries, maybe like the sort of thing we've pulled in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. But in terms of American military commitment, I still maintain, I said several months ago, that the only country you could muster up a general American population to support in a war would be Israel, would be a defense of Israel if you were to get
Yeah.
another Arab-Israeli war, or whatever, Iran were to finally attack. And again, that window of opportunity is also coming to a very quick close in the next 2 years, at least in my estimation. But nobody is going to be willing to spill blood for Ukraine, especially as things get worse within the United States, things get worse within the West. Again, it's not an issue that people particularly cared about in the first place, and they especially do not care about it now.
Yeah. Plus, I think, um, Europe still has very few, but it still has some members who are alive that were there during the height of World War II. Some of them, were children, very few adults, but many of them were children or young teenagers who witnessed that. I don't, I personally don't think they want it. I think some of the right wing element in Ukraine think that this is achievable. They played, it's like the classic example of like these little countries that with big dreams, right? And America can help them achieve it. Um, as if it just reminds me of Rome and various tribes who think like, well, I'll just convince America to do this, and we're going to gain a huge advantage, and it's really so ridiculous. So yeah, I don't, you know.
Yes, and it is with the way these statelets have these dreams of, again, not only being independent, but humiliating their former masters, so to speak, where
Hmm.
in a not insignificant part of the Ukrainian population, they believe they can humiliate the Russians and even take territory for them. I'm sure more than one of you has seen the map where they have the Ukrainian claims on regions in southeastern Russia, or southwestern Russia, excuse me, and to the point where it's getting down into like the Caucasus, saying like this is all rightful Ukrainian land before Stalin, ethnically cleansed us. But there's stuff like that. I'm sure you've all seen the intermarium stuff. All seen Poland's dreams. The point being
Oh
is like
God, yeah.
these countries that are really dependent on outside powers even for their existence. That
They literally live in fantasy land.
I,
It's
I
just
mean,
really,
it's like you almost have to admire the brazenness, but at a certain
yeah,
point
yeah.
you realize like I like I'll come out and say this, and the statement may be a bit biased with my 4% Levantine DNA, and no, that is not Jewish. Okay, they test for Ashkenazi and Sephardic and Mizrahi in particular. I'm talking Levantine. I'm talking probably Syrian because look, it's all Syria. But the dreams of Greater Syria are more realistic than the dreams of a new Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or a Greater Ukraine or this Balkanization of Russia or whatever. The SSNP has a more realistic worldview than these people ever will. I'm going to outright say that, and I know that's not a very high bar, but again, some of the larpiest nationalistic movements, again, have more
Hmm.
water than these things ever will. And again, I can't even necessarily blame these people for, clinging so desperately to wanting a national identity. But at a certain point, you have to operate realistically. Now, of course, these people aren't in charge for obvious reasons, but the funniest thing, or I suppose saddest, depending on what perspective you want to take, these right wing Ukrainian nationalists, these so called, these so called Natsocks, these people who put on the Stahlhelms and all that kind of stuff, the Azov battalion types,
Yeah.
you have to wonder how many of them actually do realize that they're being led into a meat grinder, that they are the cannon fodder for a Jewish comedian president at the end of the day, or to the interests of the same system that they claim to hate. Because, I mean, the Donbass conflict has also been very convenient in Ukraine to the point where they can send the more radical elements off to quite literally go die in eastern Ukraine, and it's two birds one stone. You get to fight back against these separatists, and you get to expunge the more radical elements of your country without enacting any open political persecution. That is.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing is they uh there's a lot of them that are willing to do this. That's okay. That's the scary part is they are like willing to become uh you know part of the meat grinder or thrown into the meat grinder, I should say, right? But are they really going to I mean, there's not that many, and if they're older, they expect the younger to do that, to do that. So I don't know. It's yeah. Uh, I'm just in awe of like the just the level of delusionment. It,
Uh,
it just
it,
it baffles me. It really does.
I mean, it is, and you know, I suppose one last thing we can touch on, just once again, is I figured I would have brought this out earlier, but I suppose it's a fine topic to finish on. Are you scared? Are you scared of the Omicron variant? I am. I'm afraid that they're going to use this to make things even more gay. Now, not that there's anything wrong with being gay, but let's just clarify that. My opinions remain neutral on the topic for the sake of YouTube. But if you want my real opinions, I think you guys can extrapolate. But
Yeah.
but with that being said, you have this new conspicuous variant popping up as people really start to get fed up with this last push of lockdowns and restrictions. Both, this is going to be confusing. Both Australia and Austria are implementing near identical policies, so this makes this damn near impossible to talk about without getting the two mixed up at some point inevitably. But when it
Hmm.
comes to lockdown, when it comes to you know not for political prisoner like quarantine camps. Like this stuff is out of like 90 schizophrenic conspiracy theorists like Web 1.0 stuff. Like this is the stuff that like made look Alex Jones look modern in comparison, and they're outright doing it. They're rubbing it in our faces, and
Yeah.
like especially some of these stories out of Australia. Oh, like oh no, like look, they're just holding facilities for blah blah blah. It's like yeah, okay, you can play this and you can play this game all you want, but they are what they are, and it does make you realize that despite all the rhetoric about freedom or whatever, liberalism is this is the inevitable outcome. It is micromanagement
Hmm.
of every facet of people's lives, and I'm not saying this is like some like rabid libertarian or anarchist or anarcho-capitalist or anything. I think everyone understands at this point that I am a very authoritarian person. If I had to put a label on it, I'd say, monarchy isn't too bad of an idea, in some circumstances. But point being is, at the end of the day, I think what one of the main takeaways from all this COVID nonsense should be is that, it's a false dichotomy about freedom and tyranny, all that kind of stuff, when the real choice is really, do you want to live in an authoritarian society or a totalitarian society? Because it's one or the other. It's either you have a
Hmm.
structured, stable society that is hands off on most things, but has an iron fist where it really matters. Or you could have the micromanagers run your life, which we're living in the latter, and I don't like it, not one bit.
Right.
Like, and it's like rich because these people like say, oh, this is like fascism, this is like communism. It's like, you know, they certainly had their problems, but I don't know. Maybe you could, dispute this with some aspects of the Soviet Union in some periods, but I don't know. Like pretty much Soviet Union, I would say post World War II. It's like the level of micromanagement that we see in Western societies today, and quote unquote liberal societies today, or liberal societies brought their logical conclusion, I'd say, is nowhere near as severe what you got under the fascist regimes of the 20s and 30s, under the communist regimes of I would say the 1940s onwards. Like any of the various dictatorships of the 20th century. And I'm not saying they were all like good governments. Again, they all had their problems, whatever. But point being is, even the most like hardline and like iron-fisted dictators, didn't have this desire of micromanagement that you get with the modern Western liberal elite. And really, I don't think we've gotten to a point. I do think we're rapidly approaching a point where you could call these people worse. But at this point, again, they have the potential to be far worse than whatever we saw in the 19th century, whatever we saw in the 20th century, because they're evil. The ones who actually did, and there were plenty who did, was much more conventional. It was you obey the state or you face the consequences. Now, that all applies the same, but the consequences in those was you go to prison, you go to a labor camp, or you face a firing squad. None of those are good, but there's clearly defined rules. There's stuff you can and can't do, and it's generally easy to keep your head down and operate in a semi normal capacity. Whereas with this, it's constantly oscillating rules. It's
Yeah.
and again, it's over the most meticulous stuff. It's very micromanaging. It's like, have you taken your 14th booster? No, no. It looks like you're going on a quarantine vacation, but I believe that's what they're calling them now. But who knows? But point being is, it is, in my opinion, at this point, I'll just outright contradict myself right now. It is far more insidious what they do and what they plan to do than most 20th century dictatorships. Now,
Mm.
I'm sure they admire some of it, and a lot of people like to say, oh, they want to be like China. I would say they honestly want to be worse than China because China falls in that example where you have the state ideology, you have what is now an autocratic leader in Xi Jinping, who's centralized power, and there are social rules. People talk about the social credit score system. There are defined rules for that. Look, I don't think that's a good thing, but you understand what the score is. There's a social credit score system in the West. There's all these things in the West, except there are no defined rules. They're constantly changing, and I would say probably outright worse than all of it. Whereas there may be an apathy or disdain among, I don't know, say the Chinese elite for the Chinese people, I would say that's a worst case scenario. Just the average Western elite and the average Western bureaucrat has a visceral response to the bulk of the population that makes up these Western nations, whether we're talking about
Hmm.
America, whether we're talking about other places in the Anglosphere, whether we're talking about Europe. That it goes beyond disdain to the point where they feel the need that because the population isn't cooperating enough, they need to be actively punished for not going along with it, whether that manifests itself in the form of lockdowns, mandates, whatever. Whereas, again, China might view you as an economic unit, a cog in the machine, but it's not nearly as I don't know, maybe my perspective is completely skewed. Maybe somebody will disagree with me on this. It's not nearly as sadistic to the point where they want to see you punished, they want to see you suffer because you have the audacity to, you know, sure you may accept the state ideology, but you don't positively affirm it at every turn. And I believe we have this conversation with some of the Rittenhouse stuff, where the point where it's not so much as keeping your head down and not challenging it, not opposing it. It has to be an act of support. It has to be an act of affirmation in order for you to be a good citizen, so to speak.
Clap louder, you know.
Yes, Queen.
Yeah. Yeah. It I think there's something else too. Like when people, one of the problems with liberalism is its abstractions, and I think when you're talking about China, right? You are talking, even though that yes, the Han um, run the place. That's true. But those people also see themselves as part of like a larger um, Asiatic complex of ethnicities and cultures and civilizations. And so a lot of what they do, I think, actually feels different for them. Uh, I think with liberalism, what you have is um, a system that has abstracted the meaning of being a person because, well, first of all, they redefine what it means to be, let's say, an American every so few years. Um, uh, they have they pit one group against another. Um, there is, I think it's different, but I think there is as much suspicion, especially for us, about whether the people who rule over us have our best interests, and I mean, and it's obvious these last 5 years we know that they don't. So in other cultures, in many ways, not being deracinated makes a lot of things bearable, uh, livable. Part of it is it's the devil that you know. Um, Part of it is that you think like, well, maybe there is hope. After all, he is one of us. That just doesn't exist really in our world, And of course, I'm not advocating for like moving to China or some nonsense, right? I'm just saying these are some basic principles that I think bear themselves out uh, in any country where that is more the case.
Oh, certainly. And you were touching on, hey, at least he's one of us. And I think you actually want a pressing example. I know I spent just the past 20 minutes contrasting these people from the regimes of the 20th century. But you want to talk about an example that you could actually draw a comparison to is the early Soviet Union was controlled almost entirely by non-Russians. And I'm not just talking about a certain group. I'm talking about Latvians, Georgians, South Caucasians, Ukrainians. Like again,
Ukrainians, yeah.
like it was pretty much like everyone who isn't a Russian is now in charge. And you had that, and again, it creates that same visceral response. Now you had over the course of it where you at least had leaders who, Stalin wasn't Russia himself, but by the end of the war in the 1940s, it more or less changed course to the point where, we were accepting that. Oh yeah, these people are the majority. It's pretty much their society, and it gradually grew into that. I suppose you could say it was, the entire history of the Soviet Union was just feuding ethnic cabals, competing for control of the country. But point being is, at the end of the day, it goes back to the one of the worst things you can have is a ruler who is, not one of you. And I think that
Hmm.
is what we get right now, or more particularly a foreign ruling class, an imported ruling class, which the United States certainly has, and those of that foundational American stock even are subject to that foreign ruling class. They are, the secondary ones, and you see this play out time and time again. And you could extrapolate that to Europe with the past half century, past you could even say
Hmm.
75 years of American domination, which of course that's like a double foreign class because you have occupation by a foreign power, which is a foreign power ruled by a foreign people, and
Right.
it just turns into a recipe for disdain and hatred. Whereas, you might have an apathy or slight disdain from people who are your co-ethnics. You still feel some connection with them, considering the fact that Putin is Russian, Xi Jinping is Chinese. You even want to get into some non, uh, let's just say, countries outside that sphere. You could say the Japanese. The Japanese are ruled by the Japanese. The Israelis are ruled mainly by Ashkenazi Jews. But point being is, the Arab states are ruled by their respective, nationalities, whether it be Egyptian, Saudi, Syrian, Iraqi, whatever. Now that gets into some of the ethno-religious conflict, but but just speaking generally. But when you have a foreign ruling class, it's probably one of the worst things a country, an empire could have.
Right.
But that is all I had. If you have anything else, I suppose we could move on to that, or we could bring this to a close.
Yeah. No, that's about it for me.
And we are in the final stretch of the year. It is now December, and we are just a short time out from our year in review episode, which is somehow going to probably outdo our decade in review episode from last year and our other previous years in review because, man, the ball just keeps rolling faster and faster and faster. And, it's certainly been an interesting year. It doesn't, it feels like it's been a century. It feels like it feels like Trump is so far in the rearview mirror. I can't even remember him. It feels like Biden has just been in there forever, and we've just been dealing with this current situation for.
It's because he's so slow.
Yeah, it's. I think you cracked it, and oh boy, I can only imagine what it's going to be like under President Kamala Harris. That's going to be fun. And if you believe Trudeau's off the record leak speculations, we're looking forward to that sometime in late 2022. So. I suppose with all that being said, we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care, guys.